So a jobs report just dropped, and it absolutely blew everyone's expectations out of the water. But according to one political channel we've been looking at, these numbers weren't just a surprise. They're supposedly proof of a huge, deliberate, even revolutionary shift in American policy. Okay, so let's get into this. The media just went wild with this. The numbers were just that strong. You can almost hear the excitement from the panel, right? Wow is right. And it's exactly this sense of shock that kicks off this much, much bigger argument we're going to unpack. And that really gets to the heart of the argument from the source we're examining. They're asking, what if this isn't just a fluke? What if it's actually the result of a conscious decision to completely break from decades of economic and foreign policy? So, to really get a handle on this whole argument, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at this core idea they call the Liberation Day thesis. Then, we'll dive into the economic data they use to back it up. After that, the geopolitical side of things, this going rogue idea. Then we'll look at what they claim is replacing the old system. And finally, we'll tie it all together with what they see as the fundamental conflict driving everything. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, a Liberation Day thesis. This is really the bedrock of the source's entire worldview, framing recent policy changes as this massive, historic break from the past. So the source really builds its argument around this specific term, Liberation Day. They've even pegged it to a date, April 2nd, 2025, and they define this as the day the White House officially ditched what they call the British free trade system to put America first. Now, that's their term for the system of, minimal government interference in international trade that's pretty much dominated the globe for decades. So for them, this isn't some minor policy adjustment. It's a full-blown declaration of economic independence. Now, what's really fascinating here is the quote the source pulls from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. They present this almost like a confession, right? The idea that America's deindustrialization wasn't just something that happened, it was a conscious policy choice. And if that's true, the source argues, then it can also be a conscious choice to reindustrialize. Okay, so let's move on to Section 2 and see how they build on that idea with the economic revolution. The source is claiming this whole rebuilding thing isn't just a theory anymore. It's actually happening. So let's look at the specific data they're pointing to. And it all starts right here. This is the headline number that got everyone talking. 178,000 new non-farm jobs. Remember, the expectation was only around 60,000. So for the source, this isn't just a good number. It's a massive signal that something fundamental is shifting under the surface. Then you have this jaw-dropper, a 55% drop in the trade deficit. The source points to this, and the president's own words calling it the biggest drop in history, as another piece of hard evidence that the country's basic economic formula is being rewritten. And the hits just keep on coming, according to the source. They just pile on these data points. Industrial production hitting its highest level since 2019. Crude steel production actually surpassing Japan for the first time since 1999. And manufacturing productivity seeing its biggest jump in almost 20 years. See the pattern? They're all presented as these huge milestones, reversing trends that have been going in the other direction for decades. So, what's the big takeaway from all these numbers? Well, according to the source, it's summed up perfectly in this quote from Peter Navarro. The argument is, these aren't soft numbers, based on how people feel. You can't just fake firing up factories and making more steel. They present this as hard physical reality, a real structural change happening in the economy. All right, let's get into Section 3, because this is where the argument pivots from pure economics to geopolitics. The source claims this economic liberation has a huge parallel on the world stage, and they call it going rogue from empire. So to define what they mean by the old system, the source actually quotes Robert Kagan, who they see as one of its main architects. The claim here is that for the last 80 years or so, American involvement all over the world, it wasn't always about direct national security. Instead, it was about upholding this thing called the American liberal world order. That whole post-World War II system of alliances, international cooperation, and trade rules. And wow, talk about a contrast. Right after defining that old system, the source hits you with this quote about NATO. The message couldn't be clearer. Those automatic commitments from the past, well, they're not so automatic anymore. The fundamental question of what's in it for us is now officially on the table. And this is where the source does something really clever, almost like a rhetorical judo flip. They take this term, rogue superpower, which was originally meant as a heavy criticism, and they completely reclaim it. So in their view, going rogue isn't about being a bad guy on the world stage. It means being liberated from the burdens and obligations of empire and finally acting like a truly sovereign nation. Okay, on to Section 4, a new diplomatic architecture. So if the old order of alliances and global commitments is fracturing, what's taking its place? Well, the source argues that something new is already rising from the ashes. This table really lays out the core difference as the source sees it. On one side, you have the old order, built on enforced alliances like NATO, and managed by what they call the foreign policy blob. That's kind of their term for the whole established bipartisan foreign policy community. And they contrast that with a new order that's all about direct, transactional deals where national interest comes first, every single time. And here's the source's proof that other major powers get this new system. They quote an editor from The Economist who says that China actually prefers this transactional approach. They see it as an opportunity, and they'd much rather deal directly with a leader than with the, quote, hawks waiting in the wings. The source then widens the lens, pointing to Russia making deals with Egypt for energy and nuclear power. This is presented as yet another example of what a world of sovereign nations looks like when that imperial management layer, their words, for the influence of superpowers, is stripped away. It's just nations making deals based on their own self-interest. All right, let's bring it all home with our final section, the core conflict explained. This is where the source ties the economic and the geopolitical arguments together into one big overarching story. So it all boils down to this. For the source, this is the ultimate struggle. It's a battle to transform America from what they call a dependent nation of consumers, basically an economic colony, into a sovereign nation of producers that's independent and totally self-sufficient. This one slide really captures their entire argument. And that leaves us with the big question at the heart of these competing views. Is this the story of a nation consciously and deliberately rebuilding its own strength? Or is it the story of a superpower recklessly abandoning the very world order it spent the better part of a century creating? The source we examined definitely has its answer, but the final judgment, well, that's still very much up for debate.